Aristotle, virtue at the apex, excess vice and deficient vice at the base. Moore, mature archetype at the apex, active shadow form and passive shadow form at the base. The geometry is identical. The language is different, sure. One is the language of moral philosophy, the other is the language of depth psychology, but the underlying claim about the structure of human character is the same. Mature human functioning occupies a summit that is not a compromise between two failure modes, but a qualitatively different achievement that transcends them both. My undergraduate degree was in archetypal psychology, with a minor in philosophy. And I read a lot of philosophy in graduate school while working on St. Maximus the Confessor. Maximus is one of the most philosophically sophisticated of the Greek fathers, deeply indebted to Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, and working through his thought requires you to know your way around classical ethics. So when I came across Robert Moore's books on the masculine archetypes, I was already steeped in classical virtue theory. And when I read Moore, I was struck immediately and repeatedly by the structural resemblance between his account of the mature archetypes and their bipolar shadow forms and Aristotle's account of virtue as the mean between two vicious extremes. As best I can determine, nobody has made this parallel explicit. That's what this episode does. I'm not going to be as practical as I usually am in this podcast. Rather, I'm going to develop this observation I find genuinely useful and offer it to practitioners who work with classical virtues or Moore's masculine archetypes, or both, and who might find the resonance between them illuminating. I want to say right here at the beginning that I hold Moore's work in very high regard. He was exceptionally widely read in Jung, in anthropology, in comparative religion, in developmental psychology, and almost certainly in classical sources as well. Whether he arrived at the structure I'm about to describe independently, or whether Aristotle was only one tributary among many that fed into his thinking, I cannot genuinely say. Intellectual honesty requires me to say so. What I can say is that the parallel is real, it is structural rather than superficial, and it has not, to my knowledge, been argued before. The four cardinal virtues, courage, moderation, prudence, and justice, make their first systematic appearance in Plato's Republic, Book 4, where Socrates identifies them as the defining features of the well-ordered soul and the well-ordered city. Plato doesn't yet give them the formal architectonic treatment they'll receive in Aristotle. He presents them more as an identification than an analysis, but the four are named and the project is begun. Aristotle takes up the virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics and gives us the doctrine of the mean. Virtue is the stable disposition to feel and to act in the right amount, at the right time, toward the right objects. It is the summit between a deficiency and an excess. The vices are not simply the absence of virtue. They are positive distortions in two opposite directions, either of too little or of too much. For example, cowardice is a deficiency of courage. Recklessness is an excess. The courageous man is not midway between cowardice and recklessness in some mealy-mouthed 50-50 compromise. He's something qualitatively different, a summit that transcends both poles rather than splitting the difference between them. Think bell curve rather than a straight line. The Stoics, Zeno, Chrysippus, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and the eclectic Cicero, preserve and transmit these four virtues to the Latin West. Cicero in particular develops them at length in De Inventione and De Officiis. He does not call them cardinal, that term comes later, but he gives the Latin vocabulary its shape. The Christian reception is where things get particularly interesting for our purposes. St. Ambrose of Milan is the first to use the expression cardinal virtues, cardinales, from cardo, which means a hinge, in two places, De Officiis Ministrorum and the funeral oration for his brother Soterus De Excessu Fratris Satiri. The term sticks in the West. St. John of Damascus, writing in Greek in 8th century Syria, names these four as the basis on which all other virtues are built including the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And St. Maximus the Confessor, whom I mentioned at the outset, makes the claim that is perhaps the most important for what follows. The virtues are natural to us. They are not an external imposition. The virtuous man is the natural man. The vices are the distortions, departures from what a man actually is when he's functioning as he's meant to function. Now, this is the structural feature to keep in mind here. For every virtue, Aristotle identifies precisely two failure modes, one of excess and one of deficiency. The virtue is not a compromise between them, it transcends them both. Robert Moore, in King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, written with Douglas Gillette and published in 1990, draws on Jung's archetypal psychology to map the structure of mature masculinity onto four primary patterns: King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Moore was extraordinarily wide-read, and the schema reflects that breadth. It is not a simple or casual thing. The key structural feature for our purpose is this. Each mature archetype in Moore's account has two of what he calls bipolar shadow forms. Not a single failure mode, but two. One active, one passive. One of excess, one of deficiency. The warrior's bipolar shadow forms are, in excess, the sadist, aggression as an end in itself, and in deficiency, the masochist, aggression turned inward or self-destruction. The king's bipolar shadow forms are, in excess, the tyrant, power without justice, and, in deficiency, the weakling, the abdication of responsibility. The magician's bipolar shadow forms are, in excess, the detached manipulator, which is knowledge weaponized, and in deficiency, the naive innocent, knowledge withheld or refused. The lover's bipolar shadow forms are, in excess, the addicted lover, someone consumed by sensation, and in deficiency, the impotent lover, numb, disconnected, gray, and flat. Moore's own visual for this is a triangle. The mature archetype sits at the apex. The bipolar shadow forms occupy the two base corners. The man who is not in conscious relationship with an archetype is, by default, ruled by one of its shadow forms and will often oscillate back and forth between the two shadow poles, which is itself a diagnostic signal worth attending to. Place the two triangles side by side, or rather, and this is the observation, recognize that they are the same triangle. Aristotle, virtue at the apex, excess vice and deficient vice at the base. Moore, mature archetype at the apex, active shadow form and passive shadow form at the base. The geometry is identical. The language is different, sure. One is the language of moral philosophy, the other is the language of depth psychology, but the underlying claim about the structure of human character is the same. Mature human functioning occupies a summit that is not a compromise between two failure modes, but a qualitatively different achievement that transcends them both. Whether Moore arrived at this structure independently or whether his wide reading made Aristotle's schema one tributary among many, I cannot say with certainty, and intellectual honesty requires that I say so clearly. What I can say is that the parallel is real, it is structural, and to my knowledge, it has not been argued before in the literature. The virtue archetype pairings make the parallel concrete. Courage and the warrior. Cowardice and recklessness map directly onto the masochist and the sadist. The courageous man and the mature warrior are, I submit, descriptions of the same human reality in different vocabularies. Prudence and the magician. The failure to use knowledge, the naive innocent, and the weaponization of knowledge, the detached manipulator, are Aristotle's deficiency and excess of practical wisdom made psychological and visceral. Moderation in the lover. Aristotle's insensible man and his profligate map onto the impotent lover and the addicted lover with striking precision. Justice and the king. The weakling who abdicates and the tyrant who dominates are exactly Aristotle's two failure modes of justice: the man who gives too little of himself to his obligations, and the man who takes too much from others. Now, given all of the similarities between the four cardinal virtues and Moore's archetypes, there are still reasons why one schema might be preferable to the other one, where Aristotle's schema is stronger. First, when moral accountability is needed. Aristotle is explicit, and this is important for practitioners, that the vices are chosen. They are cultivated over time through repeated acts. The vice of cowardice is not something that happens to a man. No, he is made a coward of himself through repeated and accumulated choices. That's harder to say in Moore's archetypal language, where the shadow form can sound like something external that possesses a man rather than a pattern he has reinforced by his own actions. When the personal responsibility question is on the table, Aristotle gives you more traction. Second, the unity of the virtues. Aristotle argues that you cannot possess one virtue fully without having them all. For example, genuine courage requires prudence to discern the right action, moderation to calibrate the response, and justice to orient it toward the good of others. Moore's schema can be used in a more modular way that misses this integration. A man in your program who has developed his warrior but not his king, magician, and lover is not, in Aristotle's account, actually courageous in the full sense. The virtue schema insists on integration in a way that Moore's doesn't. Third, teleology. Aristotle's virtues are oriented toward an end, toward eudaimonia, human flourishing, the full actualization of what a man is for. The schema is not merely descriptive, it is directional. It tells you not only where a man is, but where he is pointed and why that pointing matters. Moore's schema is more descriptive and developmental. It tells you where a man is and what he's moving toward archetypally, but the telos, the final cause, is less explicitly defined. Fourth, moral language. For men who have absorbed the tradition or who simply want to name things in terms of character rather than psychology, virtue language is more direct and less easily co-opted. You cannot easily turn courage into a victim category. You can, and people have, turned warrior archetype into an identity that excuses their own aggression. Those are a few ways in which Aristotle shines over Moore. Now, where Moore's schema is stronger. First, psychological granularity. The bipolar shadow structure gives practitioners something that Aristotle doesn't, a diagnostic tool for identifying which pole of a failure mode a man is currently occupying, and a prediction that under sufficient pressure, he may swing to the opposite pole. A masochist who is pushed hard enough becomes a sadist. Aristotle names the vices, Moore maps their dynamics and their relationship to each other. Second, developmental language. Moore's distinction between boy psychology and man psychology, the immature and mature forms of each archetype, gives practitioners a developmental arc that Aristotle's schema doesn't explicitly provide. You can locate a man on a developmental trajectory in a way that virtue language alone doesn't do easily. This is practically useful in coaching and in group contexts. Third, access and imagery. For men who are not philosophically trained, you can say you're oscillating between the sadist and the masochist, lands faster and more viscerally than you have a deficiency in the virtue of courage. The archetypal language is imagistic, mythic, and immediately recognizable in a way that philosophical language isn't. And this is a genuine practical advantage. Fourth, the unconscious dimension. Moore draws on Jung's account of the shadow as unconscious material, patterns operating below the level of deliberate choice. Aristotle's account of vice, while it acknowledges habit and passion, doesn't have a fully worked out account of unconscious dynamics. For practitioners working with men whose patterns are not fully available to them through introspection alone, Moore's framework is navigating territory that Aristotle doesn't map. In conclusion, I'd like to submit that the two schemata are not competitors. They are, in fact, two maps of the same territory, drawn in different centuries, in different intellectual languages, for different immediate purposes, but describing the same underlying truth about the structure of mature human character. Practitioners who work with both, with an eye to when each is the more useful tool, have more available to them than practitioners who work with only one. Footnote. For those in the Orthodox tradition, this convergence is, from a patristic standpoint, unsurprising. Many of the early fathers would have recognized it as an insistence of the logos spermatikos, the seminal word scattered throughout all human reasoning, such that genuine insight, wherever it arises, participates in the one logos. More didn't need to be Christian to see what the Christian tradition already knew. Okay? That's the footnote. If you're a practitioner and this has been useful, share it with someone who works in the same arena. If you simply enjoyed the episode, like it, and maybe leave a comment below. That's all I ask of you this time. Thanks for watching.